Good afternoon, everyone. This is Eric Sweden with NASIO. We're going to get started here. We had a couple of polling questions up for you if you're from state or territorial government to respond to. We're going to close those polls now and get started with our webinar. So we're very glad that you all joined us this afternoon. We have a great conversation here coming up, and I'm your host, Eric Sweden with NASIO. But here's our lineup of speakers, and we are very glad that these people were willing to come and talk to you and present on our results and react to some of what we've learned so far. We have Ed Toner, Chief Information Officer for the state of Nebraska, and Peter Kelly, Chief Deputy Director, Health and Human Services, State of California. Now, both Peter and Ed have worked in industry, so they're bringing an industry perspective as well as state government, and we really appreciate you being here, Ed and Peter. CARE has been involved in this project from the start, conducted interviews. I've sat in on a lot of those, so CARE's got this national perspective, having participated in interviews and conducted interviews across the country. So we've got three different perspectives here. We're very glad Doug Robinson is here as well. Doug has been instrumental in directing and guiding this initiative as it's gone forward. And Doug, thanks for making time for us. I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of give some background here, please.
Thank you, Eric, and again, appreciate everyone joining us this afternoon for I think will be some very interesting results to discuss. And I thought I would start with simply a little bit of an introduction, answer the why question as to how we started to look at Agile in state government. It really came out of a series of conversations after our 2016 state CIO survey. We had a remarkable response rate. 50 states responded to our survey a little over a year ago. And one of the fascinating results of that were questions around Agile and iterative software, incremental project development and delivery. And so we asked a kind of a leading edge question in that survey, and frankly surprised at the strong result when asked when CIOs in terms of how they kind of projected or forecasted the use of Agile in their state over the next 1 to 2 years, and 81% indicated they expected that to increase. So with that as our background, we were approached by Accenture to talk about a collaborative research project and a partnership to delve deeper into this particular issue and find out more about really three major aspects. Number one, what's the current maturity of Agile within state government? And we'll look at that and kind of what's the baseline. We wanted to look at the benefits. So what are the state government seeing in terms of the benefits of Agile, recognizing that in a small number of states they've been using Agile delivery for almost a decade. But again, it's not very widespread. We saw that from the rest of our report that it's still growing. It's really still kind of a nascent state in many of state government activities, and so we wanted to look at that. And thirdly, we want to look at the barriers. So what are the challenges to broader adoption of Agile? So with that in mind, constructed a series of interviews which were conducted on site at our annual conference in 2016, developed a survey instrument in conjunction with Accenture Research, which was put into the field, and that was done during the spring, late winter, early spring in 2017. We had results from a number of states, 34 states. It was interesting about this survey is not only did we ask the CIOs to respond to that, we also asked them to roll this downhill to their agency leads. We also pushed the survey out to our colleagues and strategic partner at APHSA, the Public Human Services Association, and they assisted us by also distributing it to their members. We then followed up the results with an initial findings at our conference, our mid-year conference, have subsequently spoken at a couple of other conferences about these results, and then during the summer conducted a series of interviews with a number of other stakeholders within state government to really more broadly inform this research after conducting surveys at our mid-year conference. So a lot of data, both the quantitative data from the survey you hear about today, and then qualitative data, and certainly observations and comments from our three panel experts today. So with that introduction, Eric, let me turn it back over to you and we'll get it started.
Very good. Thank you, Doug. Here's our first set of statistics. And, you know, as Doug had stated, we are finding this is rather in its early stages, notwithstanding, you know, some states have been at this for 10 years or so, but still leading edge. You know, 50% of the states have been at this for less than 3 years. And then those that 59% of those engaging or employing Agile, they're using it on 20% of their projects or less. And then we see quite a bit of mix. Kiera and I heard this on a number of the interviews, is that there's a lot of blending. So Ed, let me start with you. What's your reaction to, you know, kind of this idea that Agile is still leading edge and the idea that, you know, states are mingling this with other methodologies?
Yeah, I'm not at all surprised. Agile really has been kind of a slow adoption even in the public sector and private sector, both. I would say this actually in my private sector world, these numbers would come out pretty close to this. Still leading edge. I think the mix is also not surprising with the fact that it does have just a small piece of the pie still.
As you're looking at this now, you're coming from a larger state. California has got a myriad of agencies and various stages of maturity. What's your reaction to, you know, leading edge, or has it been around a while? And then what about the blending aspect as well?
So broadly, I think these set of data looks like a good cross-section of California governments. We've seen local and some higher ed probably leading the way, the state perhaps being a bit more conservative. We've started a demonstration project here about 2.5 years ago that's helping work through all of the bureaucracy that needs to be able to be adjusted in order to make Agile methodologies work with control and oversight functions. The thing that I would say that strikes me is the blending of methodologies is a fine thing as long as it's done intentionally. But I believe that one of the concerns that state government should be looking at is what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve, and are those blending of methodologies really getting us the results that we want?
Okay, very good, Peter. We're going to move on to a quote here that Kiera and I heard as we were doing these interviews. And, you know, we hear a lot, I think, in the press about CIOs and others saying, using this term fail fast. But in fact, we heard from more than one CIO, didn't we, Kiera? We don't want to fail at all. We want to make course corrections quickly. Kiera, do you want to speak to some of what you recall from those interviews on this concept of course corrections versus failing fast?
Absolutely. I think, you know, pretty common theme that we heard across the different interviews was that the elongated time frame of waterfall just doesn't work politically anymore. By the time, you know, requirements are drafted and, you know, God forbid you have to do a procurement, you know, by the time you then start the project, the world has changed and you've got a backlog of change requests. So we spoke to some CIOs who felt even though, you know, going to the blended point, they haven't figured out exactly how they want to do Agile yet. There's still things they're working through. It still was necessary to change because waterfall just was not working for them anymore.
Yeah, right. Very good. We're going to move on to some more statistics here. Processing improvements. Now, this is a very interesting slide because, you know, there's some states that have been employing Lean, Six Sigma. Ed Toner is a black belt, certified black belt in Six Sigma. So there's some thinking that goes along with Agile and other approaches. So Agile brings with it business process mapping. Lean and other prevailing concepts and thinking, for instance, bring in some of the ideas of how can we do things better, potentially removing variation or looking for barriers and removing those in the value stream. But there's a mentality that goes along with Lean and Six Sigma. Process reengineering is being used in some cases. But Ed, can you speak to kind of the portfolio of approaches here and how they map to employing Agile in state of Nebraska?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, the state of Nebraska has put a lot of emphasis on lean. All of our employees, every state employee is required to get a white belt certificate, and all managers are required to obtain yellow belt certificates. So the entire state is really looking at process improvement. At least they know the terminology. So it's very important for us when we're designing any type of project. When we're in that design stage, we'll start with business process mapping, and not only that, but is this really the way we want this product to look in the future? Or a lot of our projects are automating manual processes, and the very first thing we do is we look at the process, map it, and then re-engineer it. And with the entire state understanding the lean process, it has become very, very normal that the very first thing they know we're going to do is probably try to take out all the non-value added steps before we automate a process that's really not ready or not really the optimal state that we want it to be in.
Right, right. Peter, I'd like to ask you, as you look at these statistics, one of the ideas that's come up in conversation is Doug and I have looked at these statistics, and you know, Doug Robinson spent many, many years in state government, and when he was Chief Enterprise Architect, Deputy CIO, he was asking the question, part of that process re-engineering, should we even be doing this? So Peter, as you look at automating processes, do you ask that question? Well, let's get some validation for whether or not government should even be operating in this area. Has that come up as part of your evaluation of projects and justification?
Absolutely. When I look at this data set here, it's not surprising that most people do business process mapping. But I believe the value from the business process mapping comes when you take a lean eye to it, when you engage in design thinking. And so our Health and Human Services Agency has been training executives and managers in the design thinking paradigm in Lean and Six Sigma, because just to simply automate the existing business process that you have does not mean that you're going to get the outcomes that your constituents and citizens may want.
Right. And maybe one of the things we have to emphasize here is that as we revisit the concepts of Agile, that you know, we're always looking for the possibility of modifying processes where they should be modified, continually improving, and that can spin off beyond IT projects to the organizational level. And Ed, have you seen that happen? In fact, whether it's a project or not, are people starting to challenge and ask questions? Why are we doing this way? Shouldn't we be looking at better methods?
Oh, absolutely. There's a big push here in the state of Nebraska to look at and question every process we have and make sure that every step is adding value to the actual outcome or the product, and adding value to our citizens. And we see probably on a monthly basis examples that are sent out by our Center of Excellence. We have a Process Improvement Center of Excellence where they've taken processes that were 40, 50, 60 steps long and reduced them down to 10 steps. Mm-hmm. So everyone is really looking to streamline government and taking out all of those non-value added steps where we can, so that we can actually add value to the end product or add value to the customer.
Very good. We're going to move on here to this next slide, leading the way. So who is leading? And these results are rather interesting in that it's not always, or even in the majority of cases, the CIO that's leading the initiative. And I'm going to compare with our polling questions, but I do want to remind people We are looking for Q&A, questions from all of you. Please enter your questions using the chat to everyone so everyone can see the questions that are being asked. And I will also state we will be publishing the full Q&A. All of our panelists have agreed very graciously to respond to every question. And so we will be publishing all of that Q&A along with the slides to all registrants. So let the questions come through and we'll deal with those at the end of the webinar. But I'm looking at the responses to the polling question number 1. This slide presents 24%, no single person. On the polling question, 71% were saying no single person. Chief Information Officer on the polling question was 16.6%. Here we have 11%. And Kara, as you're looking across the, considering all the interviews that we did, this was a little bit of a surprise for me that the Chief Information Officer is not the lead in most cases. What was your reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, what we heard was really a wide range of use across the states and how they're implementing. There's some where it's really sort of the technology group, the CIO, the IT department are supporting the agencies and providing them tools, providing them training, but they're really letting the agencies lead. In other states, the CIO is sort of centralized and provided very strong leadership and mandated the use of Agile in some cases. And then, we're also seeing that there's variation by business area too. The federal government is having a big impact here in terms of how they are funding child welfare projects. So that's also driving the use of Agile in specific areas as well across the states.
Very good. Ed, tell us about how this came to be in Nebraska. You've got a very unique story. So fill us in on what happened.
Yeah, it's definitely an advantage that we weren't looking for, and that is we knew we're in the same situation as all states, and that's the aging workforce. We recruit very heavily from the community colleges and the local universities, and ours was the application development team, and specifically one of our products, our enterprise content management, is 100% really run by millennials who were former interns who have worked their way up. We started about 2.5 years ago really focusing on bringing interns and bringing them into that team. And now they're full-time employees. They actually wanted to incorporate Agile into their development. I agreed that was great, would start with them, provided them the training, provided them the tools that they needed to be successful, and they really just run with it. Now it's kind of organically spread to all of the other groups, and so there's a few folks on the other teams, the other product teams, that are starting to get some training from our millennials, believe it or not, to learn some Agile development, and they're starting to adopt it. Just kind of a grassroots type of approach.
I thought it was interesting when you described that earlier that you had staff coming to you and saying, what are they doing over there? What are they doing up there? They're changing the furniture around, and they got interested and intrigued by the idea that, wow, this looks interesting, and everyone's so energetic about it. I mean, they could detect the enthusiasm.
Yeah, the Kanban board was sitting up there, and I had a lot of people saying, well, what is that? And, people were pretty interested in what is this team doing. And, of course, by allowing them to really reorganize their workstations to really just adopt what they want to adopt, it really has been successful. So I guess really it's one of those things that leading with a carrot instead of a stick, and it's one of those things that the others they see that I spend a lot of time over there talking to the groups, finding out, what are the projects, looking at the Kanban board, seeing where they are. So it's definitely starting to grow from that team out.
Excellent. Peter, let me turn it over to you. What's the experience across California? You know, does these stats resonate with what you've experienced?
They do. In California, I would say that across our 140 plus departments and agencies, we've probably seen a lot of small-scale adoption by application development leads on smaller initiatives. And it's only been in the last 2 years with top cover from cabinet secretaries and from our state CIO that we've been able to look at doing this on larger demonstration projects so that we can engage in conversation more broadly about what does it take to change the bureaucracy of California in order to align it and evolved expectations about outcomes, about being able to deliver more quickly, be more responsive to our citizens. And so it takes all of these people in our ecosystem to make this work.
Right, and that leads into this next slide. You know, why are we doing this? What we've learned is Agile is bringing more of the kind of results people want. Ed, what is your response here? Have you gotten feedback from your customers regarding the success, the outcomes that you're achieving?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with everything on this slide. Business ownership, customer satisfaction. I think, you know, obviously you get a better product when the customer is involved all the way through the process. That's one of the big things with, you know, the waterfall. Often they don't see the results till the end, and then all of a sudden you've got this death march of trying to get everything fixed before the release. You're able to correct so much more quickly during the sprints and really produce what the product owner is really wanting. And so, yeah, the self-correcting, all of that obviously helps with the improved quality, the transparency, the flexibility, the customer satisfaction. And really, I think a big part of that is the customer ownership and engagement. If they're really engaged, it's going to be a very smooth process. The more that engagement drops, the more it starts to look a little bit more like waterfall.
Right. And let me move over to Peter. Peter, when you have been moving through this experience, are you finding the business is willing to step up to the plate? You know, part of this is the customer is getting more of what they want, but it comes with a cost. They have to actually commit to being on those Agile teams. So what are you experiencing there in terms of their willingness to pay that price?
Yeah, so on our demonstration project, the Child Welfare Digital Services Initiative, this is a project where the state is responsible for delivering a system to our 58 counties. And the relationship between state and counties has been strained by previous projects, I think in part because we haven't found the optimal way to engage our county customers. So this program brought county customers directly into the team full-time, as well as county subject matter experts to be engaged throughout the duration of the project. We have tried to reduce barriers by providing funding, providing options to make it easier for the county partners to be engaged, and I think it's paying a lot of dividends. Certainly, we haven't perfected it, but the excitement, the recognition by our county partners that we are working to meet their goals and that they are in the driver's seat with setting priorities for what's most valuable, I think has resonated with the group that has been involved. And they're starting to talk with other county partners about the experience. And that's the sort of communication that I think we highly value, is direct feedback from customers telling other customers that this process works very well.
Very good. And Kiera and I heard this as we're going through the interviews. In fact, our CIOs that have been leading and their project managers have said, we've got to have stakeholder involvement. Kiera, as you think back to all the interviews that have been done by you and us, this concept of customer involvement was pretty heavily emphasized. Don't you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd second the comment Ed made too, that you know, when you have that that deeper level of engagement, you are just more likely to be successful because of it. And I think we're also seeing agencies, as they see another agency deliver successfully with this method, they're starting to ask for that too and say, all right, how do I get the same results? Because I'd like to do things the same way.
Yeah, maybe the best evangelists are the successful projects. As we look back at, what we learned relative to getting less of what we don't want, the concept of large IT project failures, something that Ed spoke to, we're not waiting for hundreds of thousands of lines of code to be developed before we start to look to see, well, is it delivering? Is this initiative delivering what results we're looking for? But in fact, there are those ongoing abilities to make course corrections. So Ed, you've run into this before where you've had these large waterfall projects that too often don't deliver, but it's kind of too late to back out the investment.
Oh, absolutely. In particular in private industry where we were developing on a release cycle, everything was waterfall, and we would deliver all the code. It's one big dump, and all of a sudden in the CAT or UAT testing environment, the customer gets their first look at it, and it becomes just a real rush to code errors, fix errors, but at the same time deliver something that really is closer to what the customer was looking for. The other problem was once we put that code out there, getting the customers to even test it because of the fact that there was just a lack of attention during the whole process. Then all of a sudden we dump all this code out there that they're supposed to go through and QA in just a short period of time so we can make our release window.
Yeah, right. Now we've got a question here. We're going to bring up, this is from Mark Raymond, Connecticut, CIO, and the idea is they're trying to set expectations by informing business customers, be prepared. This may actually cost more in certain circumstances. You've got a shorter time to deliver. The solution is more closely aligned with your needs, but you've got to be able to pay that cost that we discussed a little bit earlier with Peter. Peter, what is your reaction to that? Have you, as part of your initiative working with counties and others, have you actually done some communication marketing to give them a heads up to say this is coming and it's going to be more costly? Let's get you set up so you're prepared to actually participate at that level.
So yes, and we have done a lot of communication with all of our stakeholders, the legislature, state control entities, our sponsors, counties, constantly about what is this? How does it work? What do you need to do in order to be successful? We have said it's not going to be cheaper. I don't think we've said it will cost more. I think part of that is to be found out. But what I can say is most of the large projects that we've done historically don't come in on the timetable and the budget that are expected. And when they do deliver multiple years later, they're often not what the customer really wants. So I think when we look at the cost comparison model, the opportunities to fix some of those problems which continually drive costs up on waterfall projects are inherent to Agile methodologies. That being said, the other shift that we are taking on is a transition into ongoing DevOps versus taking a project every 10 or 20 years and then letting it atrophy in maintenance and operations mode. And so to that standpoint, I think what we're going to see as we go forward is that ongoing DevOps, where we keep the product current, will be more expensive than a legacy M&O model, but we're not going to do gigantic multi-$100 million projects every 10 or 20 years going forward. So, we don't have the data yet to say it'll be more expensive, but I'm pretty sure it's not going to be a lot less expensive.
Right. I'm going to move on to this next slide here that shows some pretty impressive responses in terms of customers like to see frequent updates, 98%. Agile produces excellent results, 95%. Success with Agile comes from starting with discrete projects, then building up. Now, this is all very impressive. Ed, do you find any kind of reaction to Agile, particularly with your new young teams, We have a question here. Some people are saying, gosh, they're not telling me when they're going to be done. How do you respond when, we're delivering incrementally, and these incremental deliveries fit within larger epics, and trying to set expectations as to, are we done? Maybe we aren't done because we're on a continual improvement kind of a process.
Yeah, and I think we try to set expectations up front. We do 2-week sprints, 6 sprints in a release. If we get anything more done, we put that into the release. I really haven't had this question. It's funny they say kids, because that group of millennials I do refer to as those kids. But I haven't had that problem, other than the fact that maybe the product owners themselves have caused some of our projects to go further because they think of new things that they would like to incorporate into the process, and we allow them to do that, but we also let them know that, that is definitely going to affect our timeline. But the fact that we're giving them incremental releases really has been very satisfactory to them.
And on the other hand, oftentimes people are learning, they're going through the learning process of seeing what's possible, and the reaction is, well, gosh, if that's possible, then could you do this for me?
Absolutely. That happens very often.
So, Care, as we're thinking back over all of those interviews again, you see these big numbers. There's a lot of positive reaction here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of it is then the point I mentioned earlier, right? Like agencies who look at this and say, well, I want what they're having. And I think tying it back a little bit to Mark's earlier question too, I think although you're not necessarily spending less, I think you have the ability to spend the same, but you're spending it on the things that are most important to the business. And that is really the big change that I see. When you move away from waterfall, the business no longer feels like they only have one bite at the apple, and therefore try to get everything in that bite without knowing sort of the details of everything they want. I have yet to do a project where after we went live with the first release, the business didn't start to change their priorities once they used it and said, oh, maybe I'd like to do this a little differently, or add that, remove this. And so I think that's the big value that Agile delivers, is that flexibility that as the business figures out more of what they want based on their hands-on experience, you can then adapt to that. And therefore, if you're spending the same amount of money, you're only spending it on the stuff that really adds value for them.
Very good. I'm going to move on to this next slide, and let's do a little comparative here to our polling question number 2. We have a lack of training knowledge in how to use. We've got 75% say that is one of the barriers. And on our polling question, we had 43% of our respondents select that. Procurement is not set up for Agile projects. Here we had a 70% response. On the polling question, we had 14.5%. Culture does not support Agile, 47%. This one's a little closer with our polling question, which was at 37.1%. Now, some of this conversation we had during the interviews was around procurement not being quite set up for that. But Ed, I know you had a different opinion on that. Would you talk to that statistic, please?
I feel vindicated by the group that dialed in. I was in that. I would have picked that at 14.5. We really haven't had any issues whatsoever with procurement. In fact, I even approached the team and tried to get them to tell me some issues, and they couldn't come up with any. So I guess maybe either we're unique. We're 100% chargeback. I don't know if that makes any difference. But yeah, I agree with the people who called in.
Mm-hmm. All right. And Peter, how about you? What's your reaction to that particular statistic?
Well, so that one here in California is something that has been a barrier. And like we talked about previously, not because we have laws that make it more difficult, but I think we have 20 years of practice that has tried to solve lots of risk mitigation concerns in procuring large-scale projects. I mean, some of our projects are the order of $100 to $500 million sort of multi-year, multi-decade projects sometimes. And so our procurement processes have become very heavyweight, and they are very tightly aligned with the waterfall approach to delivering projects. So as we have moved to Agile methodologies, iterative development, as we looked at open source, user-centric design, the processes, the behavioral patterns, the working with vendors to deliver product incrementally has been challenged by a more static procurement model. So it's one that we're working through. So I think the 70% would resonate with folks here in California.
Okay, very good. And, you know, when Doug and I were looking at these statistics, you know, he's tapping into his past experience in state government. Doug, you brought up the other idea that we didn't address here specifically was budget officers. Could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I think it's kind of the same issue across those horizontal business functions that CIOs and the IT community often have to work with collaboratively. I mean, you do have to obviously interact if you don't own procurement, and as Ed mentioned, most states, state CIO organizations are 100% chargeback, and they do not own the IT procurement function, so they do have to collaborate with their chief procurement officer, but they also have to collaborate with their state budget officer. They have to, certainly over time, they're going to be working with their state auditor, perhaps with the general counsel. So I think that really kind of looks to the point of this has got to be a collaborative effort. And as we've seen with cloud and other transformations taking place in state government, these often cause disruption to the traditional business practices. Procurement and budgeting are both of those. So states have to learn how to budget for these projects in that format, and I think we're seeing the same with procurement. To Ed's point, in our national survey that we did with just the CIOs, procurement was mentioned, but not as a significant barrier. But again, we also have a relatively low level of Agile adoption. So I'm not expecting major issues, but I think we do have to recognize that procurement business practice has got to really be Agile itself to be able to deal with this. I think we heard from a lot of folks was that they were simply not calling their project an Agile delivery method, but using logistic vehicles to try to work around it. And so it may be simply, you know, a hybrid model for some time until they're more maturity in the marketplace.
Yeah, we've got an interesting comment here from Michael. And Kier, you and I had heard this as well, that in some states, procurement has actually become certified in Agile. You remember some of those conversations, Kier?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that those are ones where they've recognized the importance of, you know, because it is a change, right? Speaking sort of as the vendor on the panel, right? There are, for some participants, some of the stakeholders, it's a challenge to move from requirements being a fixed scope of work to something that's more of a roadmap. And sometimes, you know, I think you have to bring the procurement team on board. But there's also one of the things we heard pretty consistently, too, from the folks we've interviewed is you also need to think about, well, who are the authorizing agencies or the legislature, or who else needs to understand this change, what it means, and sort of get comfortable with it, because it is a difference from how they're used to doing things for the last 20 years.
Right. Here's a quote we heard during the interviews. Agile is now a proven approach, should be adopted to reduce risk. We're working with procurement on the process. Biggest challenges are changing the business culture to get used to frequent releases, developing DevOps capabilities, and that's an interesting response. Ed, what's your reaction to that quote?
Yeah, I agree that, you know, it is a cultural shift, which is a challenge. Anytime you ask anyone to change, just as there's discussion about procurement, if you ask anyone to change the way they're doing it, you're going to get, you know, that's going to be your biggest challenge. I don't know if it's, you know, it is clearly a proven approach, Do I think that everything fits into an Agile framework? I myself am not convinced of that. And if you talk to my mainframe guys, they would definitely tell you that it wouldn't fit. But I kind of want them to adopt it themselves. I don't want to push anything on them. So I think it is one of many tools to use. I like it, but it's one of several things.
Very good. Peter, I'm going to ask you to look at this quote here. The methodology is still only as good as the people executing it. And, you know, when you look at that quote from one of our CIOs, you know, how do you map that to your experience in California? And how do you address this training? We got another thing that could be part of this response from you is we've got one question here. What do you even mean when you say Agile methodology? Are you including specific things that must be part of Agile, such as Scrum? It's got to be there, otherwise it's not Agile.
So that's great. I was going to try to answer that in the same question at the same time. Our big demonstration project, when we talk about Agile as a concept of methodologies, and I agree with the gentleman that asked the question here, we look at Scrum, Lean, and Extreme Programming as kind of being process tenets. The goal is to be as lightweight in process as possible, but to highly value the processes that get us outcomes. But processes are proxies for outcomes, and people are the people are who implement those outcomes. So we've invested heavily in coaching, and not just training up front, although that was important, but training up front paired with on the ground, day in and day out coaching for our teams that help them continue to get better at using these tools to get the outcomes for our customers. I had a conversation at one point where someone asked me, when will you no longer need your coaches? And my answer was, whenever we want to stop getting better. So people are the core to everything that we do, and investing in them and giving them the skill sets and the ability to think differently and to challenge the status quo and to work face-to-face to be able to get these outcomes has been at the center of everything we've done.
Yes, and looking at this slide here, Peter, we're seeing, you know, this statement, despite the lack of training and difficulty in recruiting, only 6% of our respondents were engaging with coaches and consultants. And Carrie, you recall the stories that we heard, one in particular of a state where they had a team of young folks coming right out of college, just like Ed's team, who were so enthusiastic. They had no coach. All they had were the books. And they just poured their heart into learning Agile from those books and applying it to the best of their ability and interpreting what they read, but no coach, no mentor. And it was kind of a disaster, wasn't it? Remember, Kara?
Yeah, no, I think, you know, we heard, I would say almost uniformly across all the different interviews we did, that having a coach was critical to success, not just for the IT team, but really to help get the business on board and sort of help see them through the process as well. It was pretty consistent across everybody we talked to, not just the CIOs, but within other areas within the agencies as well.
Yeah, very good. I'm going to move on to this next slide just because of our time. But if we looked at this idea of culture clash and embracing change, extensive business involvement, and we've got a comment here from Kelly. You know, even with procurement, procurement is used to seeing specific timelines, time frames related to a project. Our budget officers are as well. And with Agile, you know, we don't. We have that kind of a circumstance. So as you look at this culture clash issue and the time frames that are involved with delivery of capabilities that fit into maybe larger epics, Ed, are you seeing any of this in Nebraska? Does this resonate with you? Does it map to what you're experiencing there? And then is procurement actually having an issue with the time frames that you're working with and how that maps with terms of service with your contractors, et cetera?
Yeah, I think procurement, and I, you know, it just now has really, I'm looking at some of the comments. I probably am not running into procurement issues because I sell all my services internally and I have my own procurement team.
Mm-hmm.
So the team, since it reports to me, it's not like I'm going out and between interagency, it's just a statement of work that we agree to and that's it. So there's not a big procurement piece of what I do. You know, certainly the cultural changes that we're making here in the state, they've been hit with so many different changes that I think they are thinking that change is the norm.
Okay, so the culture is moving.
Yes, I mean, we've gone through a full consolidation over the last 18 months. And so there's a lot of just, this is the normal way that we've been doing business.
Right. And Peter, when you think of the experience there in California, the idea of ongoing change, the idea that we don't have these projects that have necessarily time frames and contracts, are you experiencing any of those issues in contracting, timelines, time frames, or are you specifically addressing that with language that says we're not specifically saying this is going to be delivered by this date? How do you address that issue of time frames and contracts?
Sure. So we did a couple of things. We took a page out of the federal government's playbook. They had put together an Agile blanket procurement agreement, and we built something similar in California. The concept starting with the way we had procured services in the past had vendors writing about how they could solve our problem rather than actually demonstrating that they were capable of solving the problem. And so we changed the model from write about your abilities to show us your abilities. And that allowed us to down select rapidly to a smaller set of vendors, both large and small vendors, that had demonstrated ability to deliver. We then put procurement vehicles in place that actually weren't designed around long-term contracting. They were designed around reducing the size and the footprint of each of the given pieces of code we were asking to be built so that we, in fact, would have multiple vendors working together. This, of course, was an area of concern, I think, for a lot of folks. One, because it put more risk on the state, although we thought that the benefits would outweigh the risk. But what we've actually found is that the vendors that have joined us like the model, and they are proposing and have continued to work with us to find ways to have a multi-vendor cooperative working with the state hand in hand and focusing on outcomes rather than on specific contract requirements.
Very good.
This is probably a whole hour here.
That responds to Amy's comments as well regarding problems when two or more contractors are working together on a particular project. So obviously you were able to get through that, and you didn't actually have a conflict there.
Right, we were able to get through it, but it takes us being a much more active participant in the work and owning some of the risk.
Okay, some additional discipline. We're going to move on to the next slide here. This is a lot of information, but what we really want you to highlight here from our panelists here is as we look across the different functions in within a state government, procurement, general counsel, auditors, legislators, and others. We're looking at this from the perspective of moving forward, gaining more adoption, getting better at this so it becomes more of a discipline that is repeatable. We need to inform. Look at the legislators that are, the percentage of legislature that are not involved. 81% are not collaborating on Agile. And, when Doug saw this as well, he was thinking, we've got a long ways to go in terms of informing these supporting functions. So, Ed, when you look at these percentages, particularly the legislature, the auditor, and Doug had talked about the auditor as well earlier, how are you addressing informing the legislature as to what you're trying to accomplish here, and what's the reaction that you're getting?
Yeah, I think we have a unique environment in that we have a council that meets regularly, which has legislative representation. So we're able to really communicate to the legislature directly through that representative. And they have been very supportive of all of our new efforts that we've been promoting, from consolidation through Agile. So they do understand what we're doing. And we also have a unique that we only have one legislative body, so there's only 49 legislators in Nebraska. We have a unicameral, so it's very easy to communicate to our legislature.
Should we be informing citizens? Should we be directing energy toward and investment toward informing citizens regarding what we're trying to accomplish with a shift in this methodology?
My opinion is that citizens really, well, go ahead.
I was going to say, yes, absolutely. One of the things that we have done here in California on the child welfare program and intend to do on others is create as much transparency as is both physically and technically possible. To that extent, our source code, our communications, our materials are all posted publicly on the internet. And whether it's citizens or the legislature or any other of our stakeholders, the goal is to give them an inside seat to the extent practical.
Very good. I'm going to move on here just in the interest of time. So, conclusion. Agile, it's good for everyone, but more challenging for government. Both Peter and Ed have worked in industry. Peter, you were actually an Agile programmer in a former life. Do you think it's more difficult in government than it is in private sector?
I have found that it is more difficult the larger the organization is. So in my private sector experience in small organizations and small government, it has not had barriers, but in large organizations and large government, it has had more barriers. So I think it's more a factor of scale.
Mm-hmm. All right. And Ed, what's your reaction to this?
I think that really is a difference. I used Agile in a very large organization, 20,000 people. So our state is 18,000. So it's very much apples to apples to me. And so I saw the same level of resistance from both private and public. But then again, the organization aspect, I think, is absolutely a big factor.
Yeah, okay, very good. So let's look at some of these questions here. There's one coming from Adam Evans to the panel. How are you tackling the automation piece of continuous delivery? Is it adding value or acting as a hindrance to the process?
I'll start by saying that it's table stakes. When I first was a software developer using extreme programming 17 years ago, the level of automation we have available to us today was something we could only have dreamt about. And so if you don't have a continuous delivery pipeline today, you're doing something like Scrum where you have time-box sprints, you're not going to be able to successfully do end-to-end work.
Yeah. Yep. Very good. Ed, any other comments on this?
No, I'd echo that same sentiment. I mean, it's essential.
Here's a question. What's a good price model for Agile project? Do you have a specific pricing discipline that you're using in Nebraska, Ed?
Estimating projects is an art that I don't think I've ever seen done well. We give them an estimate up front, a ballpark, so that they know what they're getting into as far as the size of the project. We often, let them know that, especially with the Agile methodology, that things could go up as you start to ask for more functionality. They understand that, and we sign a statement of work up front that lets them know that this is for the basic deliverables that you've asked for, but with our methodology, it could definitely go up.
Yeah, and Peter, how about from California? How have you addressed the pricing model for this incremental approach?
We moved our development contracts to what I would describe as a time and materials not to exceed on 3-month contract options. So we have the ability to sever the relationship regularly. And instead what we're looking at is, did we get enough value out of the last 90 days worth of production to continue the relationship, rather than trying to figure out a model that may necessarily, I think to Ed's point, be more art than science.
Yeah, very good. We're going to move on to some closing remarks, but Kier, can you give us kind of an assessment as you look at all these statistics? How would you, sum up what we've learned here?
Yeah, and I'll tie it to a couple of procurement questions too. I think, it's very clear the value is there. People see it. We're still sort of linking back to the first slide. We're still early in the process and early in the adoption by governments, so I think people are still figuring things out, particularly on the procurement side. What I heard very consistently was sort of two parts. One was, questions about how best to do it, which a lot of the questions I'm seeing coming from the group are similar. And there was a lot of interest just in knowledge sharing between states and seeing what other states are trying, taking a look at how it works, and then trying to adapt it for themselves. So I think, we've heard some different examples today of how states are doing it. We heard different ones as well in the interviews, and I think there's a lot of interest in sort of sharing those examples and finding out what works, but we're still so early in the process of state adoption of Agile that I think some of this is still being figured out, frankly.
Very good. Thank you, Kier. Let me bring back our Executive Director, Doug Robinson. Doug, bring us to the finish line here. Where are we going next? What's next?
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, so just very quickly, next steps. I should mention that we've actually treated this research engagement as an Agile process. So we made that decision early on to do iterations and not simply go away for 6 months with a survey and come back and do the final report. That's been our traditional approach, and in this case we've decided to go ahead and do a series of steps, doing the initial findings, which part of that you've seen today. That came out really in April during our conference. We've done a series of op-ed pieces for various media outlets, obviously the webinar along with continuous interviews during this process, so very iterative in the way we've treated it. So that kind of the qualitative part of the interviews is really being rounded up now. It's completed, and we finished that throughout the summer. So we're going to be releasing a final report with a set of findings at our annual conference at the NASCIO conference on October the 2nd in Austin, Texas. And I'm sure not long after that we'll probably hope to schedule another event where we cover what we've learned from that. So that's where we are. Again, the materials will be available after the webinar, and we will have additional materials out on the NASCIO and Accenture websites soon after our final report in October. So Eric, that's where we are today. Back to you.
Thank you very much for that summary. Thank you all of you panelists, Peter, Ed, Kier, Doug. Really appreciate you being here this afternoon. I will remind everyone we are going to address all the questions in the chat and publish that along with the slides for this webinar. It will be a recorded webinar up on our website in a few days. So thank you all for attending, and we wish you a good afternoon, and stay tuned to NASCIO for more webinars on topics like this. Good afternoon.